Twilight Struggle is a card-driven strategy game that simulates the Cold War, designed by Ananda Gupta and Jason Matthews, and published by GMT Games.
In Twilight Struggle, players compete for political dominion of the world as either the USSR or the USA. It's playable by 2 players, and it takes 2 to 3 hours.
Players begin Twilight Struggle by placing their influence markers on the board in order to show which countries are already under each player's dominion. Next, the turn, action round, victory point, DEFCON, military op, and space race markers get placed at the start of their tracks, and the cards are divided into 3 decks: early war, mid-war, and late war. Finally, each player draws 8 cards from the early war deck, and the Soviet player gets the China card.
Twilight Struggle has 10 turns, and each turn is divided into 6 or 7 action rounds depending on the stage of the game. If one player reaches 20 victory points, they immediately win the game. The game is also won if one player triggers DEFCON 1, nuclear war. Barring that, the player with the most victory points at the end of those 10 turns wins the game.
At the start of each turn, the DEFCON status improves 1 level. Now, a status that is below 5 is going to limit which regions players can attempt realignment rolls or coups in, while a DEFCON status of 1 immediately triggers nuclear war and ends the game.
Next, each player draws up to their hand limit and the headline phase begins. So each player chooses a card and places it face down. The cards are revealed simultaneously. Now each card has an operations value that's listed in the top left. So the event text on the card which has the higher operations value will be resolved first. Now not every card that you play is going to benefit you. If there's a red star on that card benefits the USSR. If it's a white star, that benefits the USA. If it's a striped star, then that card is neutral.
Next, the action rounds begin. Each player's action round consists of them playing 1 card from their hand, either as an event or for its operations value. Cards that are marked with an asterisk are removed from the game if they've been played as events, while cards with their title underlined have a permanent effect.
If a player plays a card for its operations value, they can use that operations value to add influence markers, force realignment rolls, make coup attempts, or they can use them on the space race. Influence markers can be added to any country that's adjacent to a country where you already have influence. If you try to add an influence marker to a country where your opponent has control, then that's going to cost you double.
So to control a country, a player has to have influence markers there equal to or greater than that country's stability value. If your opponent also has influence there, then you need to exceed their influence by that stability value. Whichever player has control is going to flip their tokens over to the colored side.
It costs 1 operations point to make a realignment roll in a country where your opponent has influence. So each player rolls a die. You add modifiers depending on how much influence you have in that country and adjacent countries that you control. The player with the higher score removes a number of the opposing player's influence points equal to the difference between the scores.
Now, to attempt a coup in a country where your opponent has influence, you're going to roll a die and then add the operations value of your card. If the total is greater than double that country's stability score, then you get to remove a number of your opponent's influence markers equal to the difference between those values. If the number that's being subtracted is greater than the amount of influence they actually have there, then you get to add your own influence to make up the difference.
A coup is a military operation, so the active player moves their token forward on the military ops track equal to the operations value of the card that they played in that coup. Now, some countries are battlegrounds. If there's a coup in a battleground, then that will degrade the DEFCON level by 1.
Once per turn, a player can enter the space race by discarding a card with an operations value that's equal to or greater than the number that's listed below the next box on the space race track. Next, they're going to roll a die, and if they make the listed value, then they get to move their token up a space and gain either victory points or a special ability, depending on what that spot says.
If a player plays a card for its operations value, but that card's event would benefit the opposing player, so for example, if I'm the USSR and I play a card with a white star on it, then that event will happen anyway, unless that card is played on the space race.
There are also a few special cards. War events count as military operations, while scoring cards don't have an operations value, and they allow players to score points for the designated region based on how much control they have in that area. There's also the China card, which doesn't count towards your hand limit and gets passed from player to player after it's been used.
At the turn's end, each player must have enough points on the military ops track to equal the DEFCON level. If they don't, they lose a number of victory points equal to the difference between the two.
So as the game progresses, the mid-war and late-war cards are going to be added to the draw pile, and each player's hand limit is going to go up to 9 cards once you get past the 3rd turn. If nobody's won by the end of the 10th turn, then every region on the map gets scored according to its scoring card, and the player who ends up with the most victory points is the winner.
So as soon as you open the box on this game, it looks really complicated. The rulebook looks like it's got very small print in it, but it is actually very quick to learn, very easy to learn. You're going to catch on really quickly. It's actually the nice little constraints that this game places on the rules that makes it interesting and that makes you really work for it. And that's really great. It's very detailed in that way, and you're really going to enjoy that part of it. However, what comes along with that specificity in the rules is the fact that this can be a real brain burner when it comes to strategy. You can spend a lot of time trying to figure out what you're going to do. A lot of analysis paralysis can come into this game. It can end up taking a long, long time. So you have to be prepared for that.
Another thing that really comes with the challenges of this game is that the cards you're dealt might lead to a turn or two being a complete blowout. If you get a lot of cards with events that benefit the other side and low operations values, you're really going to be struggling to do anything effective that turn. And while that can be interesting and challenging, some people also find it frustrating to fall really far behind in a relatively short period of time. That being said, that tension between decisions and really being limited in what you can do is a really great simulation of the history of the Cold War. It's such a tug-of-war, and there's a real tension. Every decision you make could potentially benefit the other player, and that combined with the great history writing that comes with the rulebook means you really get immersed in the theme. You really feel like you're simulating the Cold War rather than just moving tiles around on a board. And that's super interesting and really rewarding when you finally manage to change the course of history and, say, make the USSR win.